Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we read the stories that live rent-free in our heads, long, slow, and all the way through. Hit subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing, and let's get into it. She had told herself she would leave in a moment. That was how it had begun, a practical compromise, the kind McGonagall had made 10,000 times in her life. She would wait until the street was quiet. She would wait until the child stopped shivering. She would wait until she was absolutely certain, and then she would go, and Dumbledore's plan would proceed as designed, and by morning the boy would be safe inside that house, and she would be back at Hogwarts where she belonged. The street was quiet. The child had stopped shivering. She was not certain of anything at all. The bundle on the doorstep did not move. It was wrapped in a blanket that had been Lily's. She recognized it, though she would not have said how, some quality of the color, or the knit, that she had seen once in a photograph, in a corridor somewhere. Harry lay in it the way infants lay in things completely. The way only the very young can surrender to sleep. One small fist curled near his jaw. His chest rose and fell. The scar on his forehead was already scabbing at the edges, pink and livid and wrong. McGonagall crouched on the garden wall and looked at it and felt the wrongness settle into her the way cold does. Not all at once, but incrementally, until you realize you have been freezing for some time without noticing. Dumbledore had explained the magic. He had been thorough, even gentle in the way he occasionally condescended to be when he believed he was being kind. Lily's sacrifice, the mother's love, ancient protection, blood sealed, requiring only that the boy be placed in the home of her nearest blood relative, Petunia, who had never liked Lily, who had written a letter once that McGonagall had not been meant to see, who lived behind that white door and did not yet know that her sister was dead. It was a sound plan. Dumbledore's plans were always sound, in the way that plans made by very intelligent people are sound. They accounted for everything except what they did not account for. A light came on in the upstairs window. McGonagall did not make a decision exactly. That was the thing she would return to afterward, in the rare moments when she allowed herself to return to it at all. She did not weigh options or consider consequences, or do any of the things a woman of her particular formation was supposed to do before acting. The light came on, and footsteps sounded on the stairs, and her body moved, down from the wall 3 strides across the frozen path, the bundle already in her arms, before whatever part of her brain was responsible for deliberation had finished its sentence. Harry made a soft sound against her collarbone, not a cry, something smaller than a cry. Behind her, she heard the latch. She apparated. The crack of it split the night somewhere. It would not be heard. A narrow side street 3 blocks. East, lamplight orange on wet cobblestones. No one watching. She reappeared with the child against her chest, and Dumbledore's letter still clenched in her fist, the envelope crumpled past reading. She had picked it up off the step without thinking. She wasn't sure when. Harry did not cry. He looked up at her with eyes that were in this light, simply dark. She would not know for some time what color they were, would not know until she held him near a window in daylight and saw that they were Lily's eyes, James's shape, and not a thing she had any right to be moved by as deeply as she was. She looked down at the scar. What she had done arranged itself in her mind with clinical precision. She had removed the child from the designated location. Lily's blood magic required the Dursley threshold. It required that Petunia take him in, required the choice of kin freely made, however reluctantly. None of that could happen now. The protection, whatever it would have been, was forfeit. She had broken something Dumbledore had spent weeks constructing. She had done it in under 4 seconds, without a word, in the middle of the night, because a light came on upstairs. McGonagall stood in the empty street and looked at the boy who was looking at her, and she thought, he is warm, and he is breathing, and he did not make a sound when it would have been entirely reasonable to make a sound. Her Patronus left her wand before she consciously formed the intention. Silver, austere, the cat's form resolving from the cold air in one fluid motion. She sent it with 3 words, nothing more. Asterisk, I have him. Asterisk. She watched it go. A light unspooling east toward wherever Dumbledore had gone. Then she looked back down at Harry. There was no version of the next conversation she was looking forward to. Dumbledore would come, and he would be calm, which was always worse than if he had been angry. He would explain what she had lost by moving. He would be right. She had no argument prepared, because she had not prepared this, had not prepared any of this, had simply stood on a garden path in the small hours of November and picked up a child because the alternative had felt, in that one unguarded moment. The wind came down the street. She pulled the blanket higher, tucking it around the curve of Harry's ear with a care she did not examine. He was heavier than she had expected. Or perhaps she had not expected anything. Perhaps she had spent the entire day on that garden wall thinking about the Potters and the war and the scar and the prophecy, and had somehow neglected to consider the particular weight of an actual child. She had known James since he was 11. She had known Lily since she was 11. She had watched them argue in corridors and then stop arguing, watched them become the kind of people who argued differently, with warmth in it, with the assumption of resolution. She had signed their detention slips and written their recommendations and stood at their wedding, off to one side, wearing the expression she wore at things she found unexpectedly affecting. James was dead. She had known that since last night, and she had not let herself. Harry made the small sound again. Not distress, something more like inquiry. Yes, McGonagall said, and her voice came out steady, which was more than she'd feared. I know. She did not know what she was agreeing to. It seemed in the moment like the honest answer. When Dumbledore arrived, it was without sound, not apparition, but something quieter, the displacement of air. The lamplight bending around him as if acquainted with his presence. He looked at her. He stood very still in the particular way that meant he was thinking, and she waited, because she had learned long ago that interrupting that stillness was rarely useful. Minerva, he said. Albus. Another silence. His eyes were not unkind, which she had known they would not be, because he had never yet been unkind to her about anything, and she suspected that was why she found him, on occasion, so infuriating. You understand what we've lost, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He looked at Harry again, and something moved through his expression that was not quite grief, and not quite resignation, and that she could not name, had never been able to name it on his face, though she had seen it many times over many years. Then I suppose, he said quietly, we find another way. The lamplight held them both. Harry's breath made small clouds in the November cold, and McGonagall held him closer than was strictly necessary, and did not say anything at all, because she had already said everything that mattered when she stepped off that wall, had said it wordlessly, irrevocably. Down the street, number 4 Privet Drive was dark again. Petunia had gone back to bed. She would never know what she had not been handed. Dumbledore did not stay long. That was the first thing McGonagall noted, not with resentment, exactly, but with the particular attentiveness she brought to anything she intended to remember accurately. He had come, he had assessed, he had spoken in the measured cadences of a man who had already begun to think past the immediate problem. He told her what she already knew about the blood magic, because he was thorough, even when thoroughness was unnecessary, and she stood in the lamplight and listened and did not apologize, because she had no apology that would be honest. Without the Dursley threshold, he said, the charm has nothing to anchor to. Lily's sacrifice exists the love that powered it, the intent. But unanchored magic dissipates. It cannot protect him. I know. He will have no passive defense, no barrier between himself and Voldemort's reach, should Voldemort find a way to reach. I know that as well. He looked at her then, not with disappointment, which she had braced for, but with something more careful than that assessment. The look he gave a complex problem before deciding whether it was solvable. "You intend to argue," he said, "that your active protection outweighs what has been lost." "I intend to argue," McGonagall said, "that a child under the direct watch of a trained witch is safer than a child left in the care of a woman who wrote to Lily twice in 10 years, and neither time affectionately." She paused. "The blood magic is a passive measure. It requires nothing of Petunia, except her presence. She might have died. She might have moved. She might have sent him to live with a relative at the first inconvenience. Passive protection is protection until the moment it isn't." Dumbledore was quiet for long enough that she heard a car pass somewhere distant, the world going on at its ordinary hours without any knowledge of itself. "You may be right," he said. It was not agreement. She was experienced enough to know that, and wise enough not to say so. What was settled in the end was modest in its architecture and large in its implications. Harry would remain with McGonagall in her private quarters at Hogwarts. This was provisional. Dumbledore used that word twice, and she understood the weight he put in it, while other arrangements were considered. He would consult with members of the Order. He would think. He used that word once, which meant it carried more freight than the word typically bore. He did not obviate Petunia. She had half expected him to suggest it and had prepared an objection, but he only said that the woman had not opened her door, had not seen or received anything, and therefore had no memory requiring adjustment. McGonagall filed this away. It was practically sound. It also meant that Petunia Dursley would spend the rest of her life in ignorance of a nephew who existed, which was, in its own quiet way, a mercy to everyone involved. The letter, Dumbledore's letter, the one that had been meant for Petunia's mat, remained in McGonagall's fist throughout the conversation. She realized this only when he left, when his quiet departure took the lamplight's peculiar bend with it, and she stood alone again in the narrow street. The envelope was ruined beyond reading. She pocketed it anyway. She walked back toward the castle as the sky began to lose its darkest register. Harry was asleep. She was not accustomed to carrying sleeping things, or awake things. She was not, if she was being clinically honest with herself, accustomed to carrying anything that required the sustained attention she was currently giving to the angle of her arms and the steadiness of her stride. But Harry slept in the blanket that had been Lily's with the complete capitulation of someone who had decided, on whatever evidence was available to him, that the current situation was acceptable, and she found she was unwilling to be the reason that assessment changed. The castle was dark at this hour. The portraits dozed in their frames, the staircases had settled into their nighttime configurations. McGonagall climbed without lighting her wand, because she knew every landing, knew every place where the stone had worn unevenly under 40 years of footsteps, and brought Harry into her quarters by memory. He woke up when she set him down, which was inconvenient, not crying, He still had not cried, a fact she had begun to find slightly unnerving, but awake and aware, and apparently interested in the ceiling. He had what she could only describe as an observational quality, which was a strange thing to attribute to a 15-month-old, and was probably simply the particular blankness of infancy, but which struck her, in the candlelight, as distinctly his. She spent the first hour improvising. There were things she did not have: an appropriate crib, appropriate food, appropriate knowledge of what 15-month-olds required beyond the theoretical minimum. She was a witch of considerable accomplishment. She was not a woman who had given any serious thought, at any point in her adult life, to the practical logistics of infant care. She transfigured a laundry basket into something serviceable, summoned blankets, and stood over the result with the expression she normally reserved for problems she intended to solve completely before sleeping. Harry looked up at her from the laundry basket. "This is temporary," she said. He appeared unconvinced. He did sleep again eventually, and she sat in the chair nearest the fire and watched the flames and tried to think about the prophecy, about Voldemort, about the 6 things Dumbledore had once told her were hidden and that she was not supposed to know about, and found that her thoughts kept dissolving into the particular quality of the silence in the room. The small sounds of breathing that were now present where they had not been before. James. Lily. She let herself think the names in full this time, in the dark where it cost nothing to be undone for a moment. She had known them both since the boy was 11. She had never quite been able to think of James as anything other than the boy, even in the years when he had become a man by any reasonable measure, because the specific quality of his troublemaking had been so persistent as to feel permanent. She had liked him in spite of herself, and liked him more when he had given her reason to. She had liked Lily without reservation from the first week of term, which was unusual. McGonagall did not give her regard away quickly or carelessly, and the fact that it had been given so easily had always seemed to her a testimony to something. They were dead. They had been dead since yesterday, and she had not. There had been no time. There had been the wall and the watch, and the decision that was not a decision, and the cold street. She had not yet found the place in herself where the grief was. She knew it was there. She would find it later. Across the room, Harry slept and breathed and had no idea. She must have slept herself, because she woke to pale grey light at the window, and Snape standing in the open doorway. He did not speak immediately. He stood with his hand still on the doorframe and looked at the improvised arrangement with an expression she could not read, which was not unusual. Severus Snape's face had been designed, she had long suspected, specifically to resist interpretation. "I saw the light," he said last night, McGonagall said. It was not a question. She had wondered, walking these corridors in the dark, who else moved in them. He looked at the basket, at the shape of the child inside it. Something crossed his face there and gone, like a reflection on moving water. He did not ask whose child it was. He already knew. Of course he knew. She watched him not ask, and she waited. "Is there anything required?" he said at last, and his voice was so carefully neutral that the effort of it was audible, in terms of provision. It was not the question he had come to the door to ask. It was not close to that question, but it was the question he was capable of at this hour, and she accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "Not at present," she said. "Thank you, Severus." He left before she could say anything else. The door clicked shut behind him, with the precise economy of a man who had learned that closing doors quietly was a form of dignity. McGonagall looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked at Harry, who had woken again, and was examining his own fist with the absorption of someone encountering it for the first time. "Yes," she said again, "for no particular reason." The castle was beginning to wake around them. 10 years passed. McGonagall did not mark them in the way she imagined a mother might, with heights penciled on door frames, with photographs arranged in chronological sentiment, with any of the soft rituals by which people measured the growth of children they had chosen. She marked them the way she marked most things, by what changed in her work, by what changed in the castle, and by the incremental, undeniable fact that the boy in her quarters was larger each September. She was not a natural mother, she had never claimed to be, had never wanted to be, and saw no virtue in pretending otherwise. What she was consistent. Present at meals, present at lessons, his and others, present in the particular way of someone who had decided that presence was the minimum requirement and had then, quietly and without announcement, exceeded it. Harry grew up, knowing where to find her. That was not nothing. He called her Professor, even in private, even when there was no one to perform it for, even at 7 years old, when she had suggested once that he might use her given name if he preferred. He had considered it with the gravity he brought to most things, and said he thought Professor was right. She had agreed, because it was, and because the word meant something to him that had nothing to do with rank. It meant the person who was there, the person who knew things, the person who would not under ordinary circumstances leave. She allowed it. He grew up in the castle, the way she had grown up in the castle, knowing the staircases, knowing which portraits gossiped and which ignored you, knowing the grounds by season. Hagrid had been an early fixture, unavoidable and enormous, and plainly overwhelmed by his own feelings every time Harry appeared, which was often. Flitwick had begun teaching Harry simple charms at 8, because Flitwick had no reliable mechanism for resisting things he found delightful. Sprout had shown him the greenhouses. Professor Quirrell, who had arrived the previous year, was perfectly pleasant and had shown Harry nothing, because McGonagall was not entirely sure about Quirrell, and saw no reason to accelerate the acquaintance. The other professors had been unable to help themselves. She had noticed this without being able to entirely prevent it, and had decided not to prevent it on the grounds that a boy who knew no one was worse off than a boy who knew too many people who were fond of him. What she had kept sparse was the rest. Your parents died bravely. There was a war. It is over. He had asked the expected questions at the expected ages. Who was my father? What was my mother like? Why is there a scar? And she had answered them as honestly as the age permitted, which meant that by 11 he had a reasonably accurate account of what had happened, and a significant number of questions she was not yet sure how to answer. He knew he was famous. She had not told him. The world had told him. In the oblique way the world tells children things their guardians would prefer to control. The staff had been careful, but children learn by inference. A portrait that paused its conversation when he passed, Hagrid's eyes going bright in a particular way at particular moments, the quality of Dumbledore's attention during his occasional visits. Harry had assembled it from pieces the way he assembled most things, quietly and without announcing that he had finished. He had not, as far as she could tell, become vain about it. This was a relief, and she attributed it to no particular virtue on her part, more to the essential stubbornness of his character, which she recognized and did not entirely understand and found privately admirable. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday in late July, addressed to the Transfiguration Office, Hogwarts, and she set it on her desk and stood looking at it for a moment before she touched it. She had known it was coming. She had known it was coming for 10 years in the way you know a thing that is still distant enough to postpone feeling. It arrived, and it was not distant anymore, and she stood at her desk in the early morning light and thought, "Here it is." Then she set it down and felt something she did not name. She took him to Diagon Alley herself on a Thursday, in Muggle clothes that he wore with the mild discomfort of someone unaccustomed to them. They took the flue to the leaky cauldron and walked through into the bright chaos of the alley, and she watched him try not to stare at everything and fail, and permitted herself a small private satisfaction. Gringotts first. She had been once before, years ago, to arrange access to his parents' vault, had done the legal and bureaucratic work of establishing guardianship with the particular patience she brought to things she found aversive but necessary. The goblins had been satisfied eventually, and the account remained in his name, and she had not touched it for anything other than school expenses. She told him this on the cart going down, because she believed in telling him things in advance when advance telling was possible, and he listened with the focused attention he gave to information he was filing away. He did not say much. He rarely said much in transit. This was she had observed his processing time, and she had learned not to interrupt it. The vault was full in the way his parents' vault would be full, because James and Lily had not expected to die at 21. He stood in the entrance and looked at it, and she watched his face go through several things. It did not quite complete, and she said nothing because nothing was the right amount on the cart. Going back up, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They were real people." "Yes," McGonagall said, "I knew that. I mean, I just—" He stopped. Started again. They owned things. She understood what he meant. She thought he did not need her to explain what he meant. "Yes," she said again. He nodded once, as though settling something, and looked back at the tunnel ahead. She looked at his profile, James's jaw, Lily's forehead, wholly his own expression, and did not look away until the light changed. They moved through the rest of the alley with the methodical efficiency she preferred. Robes, scales, telescope, cauldron, flourish and blots, where he disappeared into the stacks for 20 minutes and emerged with his book list and 2 extra volumes she had not suggested and did not discourage. She bought him the extra books without comment, which was a thing she had learned to do. Make the gesture without annotating it, because commentary defeated the point. Ollivander's was last. She had expected this to be difficult in a way she was not fully prepared for, and she was correct. The shop was dim and close, and smelled of sawdust and magic, and Ollivander himself came around the corner with the absolute noiselessness that she had always found profoundly unsettling, and regarded Harry with an attention that was too direct to be merely professional. "I wondered when I would see you, Mr. Potter," he said. 17 wands. She stood near the door and watched the trail of failed attempts with the expression she kept for things she was not permitted to interfere with. Then, the 18th, holly, 11 inches, a single phoenix feather at its core, and the warmth that expanded outward from Harry's hand made the dust motes dance. Ollivander's face went somewhere complicated. "I remember every wand I have ever sold," he said. "The wand that chose you is the brother of the wand that gave you that scar." He paused. "The brother wand did great deeds and terrible things. I expect we shall hear great things of you, Mr. Potter." Harry looked at the wand. He looked briefly at the scar on his forehead, which he could not see but was clearly aware of, with the precise self-consciousness of someone who has been aware of a thing their whole life. Then he looked at McGonagall. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "We'll take it," and reached for her purse. And that was that. Outside, the alley had gone gold in the late afternoon. Harry walked beside her toward the leaky cauldron with his parcels and his wand box and his 2 extra books, and he did not say anything for a while. "Professor," he said finally, "yes. Do you think it matters? The brother thing?" She considered this honestly, because he deserved honesty and could tell the difference. "I think," she said, that wands choose, and that the choosing means something. I don't know what it means. Neither does Ollivander, whatever his tone implied. Harry seemed to find this acceptable. They walked on. The leaky cauldron opened ahead of them, the door slightly ajar, the smell of old wood and fireplaces drifting out into the fading summer light. In September, he would board the express, and she would not be on it, and everything would be different in the way that everything eventually was. But that was September. Today he walked beside her with his parents' money in his pocket, and a wand that the world had apparently been waiting to give him, and he was, against every odd she had ever calculated, entirely all right. She pushed open the door. The train was louder than he had expected. Harry had been on the Hogwarts Express precisely 0 times before this morning, which he had known intellectually but which only became real when he stood on platform 9 3/4 with his trunk and his owl, and the particular sensation of being somewhere that expected things of him he had not yet done. The platform was full of noise, families, trunks, owls protesting in their cages, the hiss of the engine. And he stood in the middle of it, and felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely unmoored. McGonagall had walked him through the barrier. She had not made a ceremony of it. She had said, "Keep moving, don't stop," and stepped through the solid wall as though it were not solid, and he had followed. And then there was the scarlet engine and the steam and the crowd, and she had stopped and turned to look at him with the expression she kept for occasions she was taking seriously. "You have your ticket," she said. "Yes." "And your book list, though you've already bought everything on it." "Yes." "And you know where the castle is? I've lived there for 10 years. I know you have." She looked at him for a moment in the particular way that meant she was filing something. "The sorting will be in the evening. I will see you there." He had wanted, briefly and irrationally, to ask her to come on the train. She would have said no, and she would have been right to say no, and he knew this, and none of it changed the brief, irrational wanting. He picked up Hedwig's cage and hauled his trunk toward the nearest door, and did not look back, because looking back was not the kind of thing he did. He found a compartment, 2/3 of the way down the train. The boy already sitting in it was red-haired and long-limbed, and had the specific look of someone who had arrived somewhere before. All his siblings, and was now experiencing a novel solitude. He was not entirely sure what to do with. He looked up when Harry slid the door open. "Mind," Harry said. "No, go on." A pause, and then, "I'm Ron Weasley, Harry Potter." Ron's eyes went directly to his forehead. This happened. Harry was accustomed to it, had been accustomed to it since he was old enough to notice, which was earlier than people seemed to expect, and he had learned to wait through it without reacting, the way you waited through any involuntary thing. Ron looked, and then Ron seemed to become aware that he was looking, and went slightly pink. "Sorry," Ron said. My mum talks about you." "Well, everyone does, I know," Harry said, and sat down. He did not say it unkindly. It was simply a fact, and Ron seemed to receive it as one, because the awkwardness passed more quickly than these things usually did. By the time the train had cleared the outskirts of London, they were talking about Quidditch. Ron had strong opinions, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for an audience that was not a sibling, and Harry found with some surprise that he was listening rather than performing the act of listening. The scar meant something different to Ron than it did to Harry. Harry had understood this in the abstract for some time. He understood it more concretely now, watching Ron talk around it, watching the awareness of it pull slightly at the edges of his sentences. To Harry, the scar was a fact. It was on his forehead. It had been there his entire life. It had no texture, except the slight unevenness McGonagall's fingers had traced, once very briefly, when he was small, and which she had not mentioned. He did not remember Godric's Hollow. He did not remember Voldemort. He remembered nothing from before the castle, which meant he had no before to mourn. To everyone else, it was a story. He was the end of the story. He had read this in their faces for years without having the words for it until now. Watching Ron's eyes flick to his forehead and back, he thought about saying something about this. He thought about it for the length of approximately 2 seconds and then decided against it, because there was no version of the sentence that did not make him sound strange, and he had learned early that sounding strange was a complication. He said instead, "What position does your brother play?" Ron told him. At some length the train moved north. The Great Hall, in his experience, was a room. He had eaten in it 100 times, had sat at the staff table for years, and then had been quietly migrated to various student-adjacent positions as he aged, and it became awkward for him to keep sitting with the adults. He did not find it impressive the way the first years clearly found it impressive, which made him feel slightly outside the shared experience of the moment. Then his name was called, Potter, Harry. The silence was different from the silence for anyone else. He had expected some reaction. He had known there would be some reaction, because there had been reactions to his presence his entire life. But the quality of this silence was particular. It was not startled. It was something older, something that had been waiting. He sat on the stool. The hat came down over his eyes, and he was in the dark. A voice said, in a tone that seemed genuinely interested, "Well." He thought firmly and without preamble. "Gryffindor," the hat said. "I can see that. I can also see several other things. May I take a moment?" He considered, pointing out that he was sitting in front of the entire school. He did not think this would move things along. It took longer than it had taken anyone else. He knew this because he could feel the silence stretching, and did not need to see faces to know they were all watching. The hat moved through him, through things he had not expected to be found, and he sat very still, the way he sat still when things were happening that he could not control, which was the only option. Then the hat said, with something that sounded almost like satisfaction, "Gryffindor." The table on the far left exploded. He got up, returned the hat to the stool, and walked toward the noise with the composed expression of someone who had been practicing composure his entire life. He sat down. A girl across from him, with an enormous quantity of hair, said, "Well done," with the precision of someone who had been wanting to say it correctly. Ron dropped into the seat beside him a few minutes later, and the feast began, and the ceiling showed stars, and Harry ate and talked and kept his hands steady and did not at any point look toward the staff table. He looked once. He could not help it. McGonagall was watching. She looked away the instant his eyes found her, which was the most she was going to give him in public, and which he understood entirely. He looked back at his plate. He was, all things considered, fine. She stopped him in the corridor after the feast. Not stopped, she fell into step beside him as the students funneled toward their dormitories, and he peeled off from the flow of Gryffindors without needing to be asked, because he knew that walk. She did not say anything until the noise of the crowd had receded. "Gryffindor," she said. "Yes, I am not surprised. I know." She looked at him sideways, in the way that was not quite a look. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, and meant it, mostly. She nodded, and they walked a few steps in the castle's settling quiet, and it was the kind of quiet that had been between them his entire life, not empty, not waiting to be filled just there, like all the old, reliable stonework around them. "The girl," she said, "with the hair. Hermione Granger. She introduced herself at the feast. She's already read the textbooks." McGonagall said, in the precise register of someone filing this information favorably. They reached the corridor junction, where he needed to go left, and she needed to go straight. He stopped. She stopped. The castle breathed around them. "Good night, Professor," he said. "Good night," she said. It was the way she always said his name. Not cold, not warm, just exactly accurate. Like something she had learned the precise weight of long ago and had never had cause to put down. He went left. October arrived the way October always did at Hogwarts, decisively, without apology, turning the grounds gold and the mornings sharp. Harry had been at school for 5 weeks. He had not yet found the rhythm of it entirely, which surprised him. He had lived here his whole life and managed somehow to not know it like this. Moving through it in a group, with a schedule, with people who had questions and opinions, and the persistent human need to talk. It was a different castle than the one he'd grown up in, quieter and more his own. He suspected this would take longer than 5 weeks. The broomstick lesson happened on a Tuesday. Madame Hooch lined them up on the lawn with their broom. Harry had flown before. Madame Hooch herself had taken him up once, years ago, when he was 7, and had asked with sufficient persistence that McGonagall had relented. But he had not flown like this in the open air with the grounds laid out below. He stood beside his broom and thought, "This is something I know." He did not think much after that. Neville went up too fast and too far, unable to stop, his face blank with terror, and then he was coming down the wrong way, hard, and something snapped, and the Remembrall went spinning off his wrist in a long, glittering arc. Madame Hooch was on the ground getting Neville sorted. Harry watched the Remembrall trace its arc. He was in the air before he had decided to be in the air. This was the part he couldn't explain afterward. The decision not being a decision, the wanting and the doing collapsing into a single instant. He went up, he banked, he caught the Remembrall at approximately 20 feet with one hand, and the whole sequence felt unremarkable, felt like something his body had known how to do for longer than he could account for. He became aware, coming back down, that the lawn had gone silent. Draco Malfoy's mouth was open. Hermione looked like she was trying to decide something. Ron's expression was one Harry had not yet learned to read, though he would. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. McGonagall's voice came from somewhere above and to his left. "Potter!" Her tone was precisely uninflected, which was the worst possible sign. "Follow me!" She was standing in the courtyard gallery where she had apparently been observing the lesson from a height. He landed, put his feet on the ground, and followed her inside with the Remembrall still in his hand, because he had forgotten he was holding it. She led him through a corridor and up a half-flight, and into a small anteroom he vaguely associated with administrative purposes. She shut the door. He stood in the middle of the room and waited. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "I didn't learn," he said. "I just flew." She made a sound he could not categorize. She was looking at him with the expression she rarely showed, the one that went somewhere far back behind her usual composure. And he stood very still and let her look. "Your father," she said after a pause that had several things in it she didn't say, "was a natural flyer. He made Seeker in his first year." Harry processed this. "You recruited him too. It wasn't a question." She gave him the slight shift of expression that meant she recognized he'd assembled something correctly. "Yes." He turned the Remembrall over in his hands. "That's the most you've said about him, unprompted. I'm aware. Did you know him well?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Well enough," she said. "He was difficult some of the time, and gifted all of it." A pause. "You have his instinct in the air, and your mother's precision." Somehow, in the same movement, he did not know what to do with that sentence. He did not think he was supposed to do anything with it. He thought she had simply found herself saying it, the way she occasionally found herself saying things she'd evidently been holding for a while. He looked down at the remembrall, which was green now and tranquil in his palm, and waited. "I'm breaking my own rule," she said, which he understood to mean she'd made a decision before she came in here. "We need a seeker." "I know." "That was a remarkable thing you did." It didn't feel remarkable. "No," she said, "that's rather the problem." But she said it as though the problem was also, in some complicated way, not a problem at all. She told him she'd arranged things with Flitwick, who handled the Quidditch schedule, and that he was not to tell anyone else yet, which he understood to mean the team would be told before the school. He nodded. She opened the door, and the anteroom reconnected to the ordinary castle. He went back to his lesson. It did not fly again that day. But the instinct stayed with him, humming faintly somewhere behind his sternum, like something that had been waiting a long time for the right occasion. Halloween fell on a Thursday. The feast was extraordinary, in the way the castle's feasts were always extraordinary. Pumpkins carved and floating, enough food for 4 times the student body, the general atmosphere of a place that knew how to mark occasions. Harry ate and talked and watched Hermione try to explain something complicated about wandwork to Ron, who was listening with the expression of someone who wanted to agree but wasn't sure. He followed. Then Quirrell came through the doors at a run. He nearly fell. His turban was askew, his face the grey of old wax. He reached the staff table and grabbed its edge and said too loudly, in the sudden stillness, "Troll, in the dungeons, thought you ought to know," and then fainted with the dramatic conviction of someone who had been holding himself together for exactly this long. The hall erupted. Dumbledore had them moving before the noise peaked. Prefects, dormitories, orderly progression, and Harry moved with the crowd because there was nothing else to do. And then Ron said, low and urgent, "Hermione doesn't know," and Harry stopped. She had left early from the feast. Ron had said something unkind about her earlier, in the corridor, the kind of thing that comes out more honest than intended, and Harry had watched her face go somewhere closed before she walked away. He had not said anything about it then because it was between the two of them, and he judged it better to leave it. He wished now that he'd judged differently. "Which bathroom?" Harry said. "The one by the charms corridor." They were moving before the last Gryffindor had turned the corner. The crowd thinned and then disappeared, and the castle was suddenly just corridors, their footsteps. And somewhere below them, something that moved very heavily and smelled of things left too long in the dark. It was already in the bathroom. This was the wrong order of things. They'd meant to find Hermione first, and instead they had both at once, and there was approximately 1/2 second to decide what to do with that. Hermione was backed against the far wall, looking at the troll with the expression of someone who had transcended panic into something more focused. Harry grabbed a pipe off the wall without entirely meaning to, and threw it. The troll turned around. What followed was not elegant. He went up on the troll's back, because it seemed like the only place the club couldn't reach. His wand went somewhere into its nose, which was not a technique he had ever read about, and the stunning spell was improvised, and the troll was unconscious, and he was on the floor. Hermione had cast a levitation charm to help bring the club down. He looked at her. She looked at him. Ron made a sound that might have been a laugh, and was not quite. McGonagall came through the door. She looked at all three of them. She looked at the troll. She looked back at Harry, who was sitting on the bathroom floor, covered in something he chose not to examine. And she saw, he thought, exactly what had happened, and exactly why. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone recognizing a pattern she had always known was going to assert itself. "Out," she said. "All three of you, into the corridor, now." They went. In the corridor she looked at Harry, and he looked at her, and she shook her head very slightly, the way she shook her head when she was not going to say what she was thinking, because it was something she'd said before, and expected to say again, at intervals, for the foreseeable future. He had run toward it. He had always been going to run toward it. They both knew. She gave them 5 points apiece for nerve, and told them they would discuss this tomorrow, and sent them to their dormitory with a precision that left no room for debate. He went. He did not look back. But he thought, going up the stairs, about what she'd said in the anteroom. Your mother's precision. Somehow, in the same movement. He thought about the remembrel in his hand, and the lawn gone silent, and the way the air had felt clean and fast and absolutely right. He thought, I want to do that again. He was already looking forward to practice. He found it on the 3rd night of December at 11:30, in an unused classroom on the 4th floor that smelled of chalk dust and old curtains, and the particular stillness of rooms that had been left alone for a long time. He hadn't been looking for it, he had been walking. One of those late circuits of the castle he took sometimes, when sleep wouldn't come, familiar enough with the corridors and the prefect's patterns to move without being caught. He had pushed open a door he'd pushed open before, expecting the same empty dark, and instead there had been light, not candlelight, something quieter than that. The mirror stood against the far wall where nothing had stood before, ornate and taller than him, framed in gold that had gone slightly dull. He walked toward it, the way you walk toward something that doesn't quite make sense yet, expecting to resolve into something ordinary at close range, and instead he stopped. His parents looked back at him. He stood there for a long time. He was not sure exactly how long. The woman had his eyes. He knew this because he had been told it once by Dumbledore, with a careful delivery of someone imparting something they expected to matter. And the man had his hair and a face that was almost a face he knew from mirrors, older and not quite. They were smiling. They looked, in the mirror, like people who knew him. He went back the next night, and the night after that. On the 4th night, McGonagall was standing in the doorway. He did not hear her come in. He heard her suddenly. Behind him, the precise quiet of her breathing, which he had known all his life, the way you know the specific sounds of a place you've grown up in, and he turned around. She looked at the mirror. Then she looked at him. Her face was the one she showed when she was not going to perform anything, which was the face he trusted most. "How many nights?" she asked. 3. She nodded, as though she'd expected that number. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and for a moment she looked at the mirror too, though he could not tell what she saw in it, and her expression did not change. "It's called the Mirror of Erased," she said. Desire spelled backward. It shows the viewer the deepest, most desperate desire of their heart. A pause. It doesn't show the future or the present, or anything true. He looked back at the glass. His mother was still smiling. "I know it's not real." Knowing it isn't real and understanding that it can't be real are not the same thing. Her voice was not unkind. People have wasted years in front of this mirror, died in front of it, in the older stories. He thought about the 3 nights. The way the walk down had started to feel like something he was owed. He did not say any of this. "Your parents," she said after a moment. Yes, she was quiet. The mirror stood there, patient as furniture, reflecting nothing she reacted to. They were real people, she said finally, not the image, not what you've been told or what you've pieced together or what that glass wants you to believe you're missing. James Potter was foolish and talented, and occasionally insufferable, and he grew up. Lily Evans was one of the most gifted students I ever taught, and also one of the most stubborn, and she knew exactly what she was doing on the night she died. A brief silence. The people in that mirror did not come from anything I could have shown you. The mirror has found the shape of what you want them to be. That is not the same as them. He kept his eyes on the glass. She almost never used his name. He looked at her. They were braver, she said, than that image will ever be, and so are you. Come away. He looked at the mirror for one more second. His mother's eyes, his father's hands, the smile that had never existed in the world he'd actually lived in, and then he turned and followed her out. She pulled the door shut. In the corridor, the ordinary castle resumed, cold stone, torchlight, the distant sound of something settling in the walls. He walked beside her toward the staircase without speaking, and she did not fill the silence, because she never filled silences she didn't need to fill. At the foot of the stairs she stopped. "I'll speak to Dumbledore," she said. "The mirror will be moved." He nodded. "Go to bed," she said. Not unkindly. Not with any performance of softness. Just the sentence, clean and direct, which was the way she had always spoken to him and which he had always preferred. She waited until his footsteps had fully receded before she moved. She went to Dumbledore the following morning before breakfast and said what she had found without editorial. The classroom, the mirror, 3 nights, the boy, alone with it. Dumbledore listened with the stillness he brought to things he found significant, and when she finished he thanked her and said he would have it moved to a location less accessible. "Good," she said. She was turning to leave when he said, with a studied casualness that had never, in 40 years, actually deceived her, "I wonder if you've noticed anything unusual about Quirinus Quirrell." She stopped. Define unusual. His manner since returning from his sabbatical, a certain nervousness. He paused. He was not always so afflicted. She thought about Quirrell in the corridors, the flinching at loud sounds, the turban, which he had not worn before and which smelled, faintly and inexplicably, of garlic, the way he moved now, as though something behind him was always about to speak. "I had noticed," she said. "I would prefer," Dumbledore said, "that Harry remain away from the 3rd-floor corridor, the one on the right-hand side." She looked at him steadily. "What is on the 3rd floor?" Dumbledore smiled. She knew the smile. She had known it for decades. It was the smile he produced when an answer would require more explanation than he intended to give, and when he calculated that the person asking would ultimately accept its absence. He had learned over years of working with her that this calculation was frequently wrong, but it had never stopped him making it. "Something that requires guarding," he said, "and that is, for the present, being guarded by Quirrell." Among others, she let the silence sit for a moment and watched his expression remain entirely pleasant. She thought about pressing. She assessed the probability of receiving a direct answer and placed it precisely where it deserved to be placed. "I'll keep him clear of the corridor," she said. "Thank you, Minerva." She left his office with the particular tiredness of someone who has been given half of a problem and all of the responsibility. Harry asked her about Voldemort at Christmas. Not asked, stated it first, as was his habit when the question was one he'd been carrying for a while. They were in her office, the grounds outside gone white and silent, most of the castle emptied out for the holiday. He was sitting across from her with a cup of tea going cold in his hands, and he said, without any particular preamble, "Is he actually dead?" She set down her own cup. She thought about the provisional and careful things she might say, the measured versions, the softened edges, and then she looked at him. 11 years old and entirely still, watching her with those eyes that had always been too composed for his age, and she told him the truth. "No one knows," she said. "He lost his body. He lost, apparently, a great deal of power, but no one who has looked at the question carefully believes he is simply gone. He absorbed this." She watched him do it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the breath that steadied itself on the way out. He processed difficult information the way he processed most things, quietly, completely, without asking her to manage the difficulty for him. "That's what I thought," he said. "I imagine it was." Outside, the snow was coming down again, soft and indifferent. The fire was the only warm thing. "Will he come back?" Harry asked. "That," she said, "is a question I can't answer. Not because I'm choosing not to, because I genuinely don't know." He looked at the fire for a moment. All right, she agreed. He picked up his tea. She picked up hers. The snow continued falling on the grounds. It was not comfort, exactly, but it was something they were both accustomed to. The honest version of a hard thing, held between them without ceremony. That had always been enough. January settled over Hogwarts the way it always did, with the particular grey determination of a season that had no interest in being liked. The corridors were cold even when the fires were lit, and the lake outside the windows held a pewter stillness that made the afternoons feel shorter than they were. Harry had been back from Christmas for 3 days when he sat down in the library with Ron and Hermione and said quietly that he thought he knew what was under the trap door on the 3rd floor. Hermione looked at him. Ron looked at him. Then they both looked around at the neighboring tables with the instinct of children who had already learned that some conversations required empty air. "Not all of it," Harry said. Hagrid mentioned something. He said it was between him and Dumbledore. But he looked the way people look when they've said more than they meant to, and there's the dog. 3 heads. "Fluffy," Ron said, and Hermione looked at him with an expression that suggested she had already filed this under things she wished she hadn't heard. "You named it," Harry said. "I didn't. Hagrid did right." Harry kept his voice level, because they were in the library, and because Hermione was already gripping the edge of the table in the way that meant she was deciding how worried to be. "There's something underneath, below the dog. We've all been hearing things, the corridor at night, the way the 3rd floor sounds different, and whatever it is, someone's trying to get to it." "Snape," Ron said, immediately. Harry said nothing to that directly. He had been watching Snape since September, with the particular attention of someone who had been told that something is not a threat, and has not fully believed it. Snape moved through the castle like someone carrying weight in a pocket he did not acknowledge. His eyes tracked Harry in lessons with a quality that wasn't malice exactly, but wasn't not malice either, and twice now Harry had come around a corridor corner to find him standing outside the 3rd floor entrance, which was once more than could be coincidence. "He's been limping," Hermione said reluctantly, as though she had been holding this back and had decided it was relevant enough to release. "Since before Christmas. His leg." "I noticed," Harry said. "That doesn't mean—" She closed the book she hadn't been reading. "The protections are supposed to hold. Whatever they put there, it's behind Fluffy, and behind Fluffy there are other things. We don't know what. We don't know how many." A pause. "We shouldn't be trying to find out." Harry looked at her for a moment. He thought about the thing Dumbledore had said to McGonagall. He didn't know the exact words, but he knew the shape of it, the way that conversations he wasn't supposed to know about sometimes left a residue on the people who'd had them. She had been watchful in a different way since Christmas. "I know," he said again. "I'm not planning anything. I just think we should know what we know." Ron pushed a roll of parchment across the table and uncapped a quill. Right then, what do we know? They sat there for 40 minutes, voices low, Hermione adding things she'd found in books she'd already read, and correcting things Ron had gotten approximately right. By the end, they had the dog, the trapdoor, something below, probably several somethings, and a general impression that the protections had been designed by multiple people for a reason. Also Snape's limp, which Hermione still refused to list as evidence, and which Ron wrote down anyway. Harry walked back to Gryffindor Tower afterward, and did not quite shake the feeling of a question acquiring its own momentum. She had been watching them for a week. It was not surveillance, exactly. It was the particular awareness of someone who had known children long enough to recognize the specific quiet that preceded decisions. Harry ate his meals with the focused inattention of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. Hermione had that look she got when she was reading ahead, except she wasn't reading ahead, she was reading sideways, in directions McGonagall could estimate from the titles if she looked when they weren't looking. And Weasley, who wore most of what he was thinking in plain view, had started glancing at the corridor staircases with the half-considered expression of someone working out routes. She knew that quiet. She had seen it before in other children over many years. It was the quiet of children who had decided something was their business and were working out how to make it so. She did not intervene. Not yet. But she went to Dumbledore that night. His office was warm and smelled of something she could never identify. Parchment and time, she'd decided long ago, which was not a real smell and was entirely accurate. She said what she had observed, without shaping it into accusation. 3 students who were paying more attention than they should to the 3rd floor, Harry among them. Dumbledore listened. He had that particular stillness that she had learned to read. Not as calm, but as calculation, the stillness of someone assembling a picture they already had most of. The protections will hold, he said. I know that. She kept her voice even. That's not my concern. What is your concern? That Harry thinks Snape is after whatever is being protected. She watched his face. And that he is 11 years old and has already walked toward a troll rather than away from it, and that I do not think information will stop that impulse. Only involvement might. Dumbledore picked up one of the objects on his desk and set it down again. An old habit, not absent-mindedness. She had stopped taking it personally decades ago. Is Snape after it? She asked. The pause was a fraction longer than a confident denial would require. Snape, Dumbledore said, is guarding it. She sat with that for a moment. Then, he is not the threat Harry thinks he is. No. The firelight moved across his half-moon spectacles. Or we might consider that a boy who has been told there is no threat has very little reason to exercise caution. Whereas a boy who believes the threat is real will exercise it in the entirely wrong direction. She felt the familiar tiredness settle across her shoulders. Not exhaustion, but the specific weight of disagreement she'd had too many times to find new words for. Albus, he is watching, he is thinking. He is not the kind of child who accumulates that much observation and does nothing with it. No, Dumbledore agreed, and there was something in his voice she did not entirely like. Something that was almost satisfaction. He is not. She stood. She had learned over the years to identify the precise moment when continuing to speak would not change the outcome and would only spend the energy she needed for everything else. The protections will hold, she said, and it came out with more emphasis than she'd intended. Not quite a question. They will hold, he said. She left before she said something she could not take back. The corridor outside was cold and very quiet, and she stood in it for a moment with her hand still on the door, and the conversation settling around her like sediment the protections would hold. Snape was guarding, not hunting. Dumbledore was watching Harry in the way he watched things he found useful, and that watching had a quality she did not always like, but had not yet found grounds to refuse. She went back downstairs. She was not worried about the protections. She was worried about the boy who had learned, across 11 years of living in a castle full of things she had tried to keep him clear of, that if something mattered, you moved toward it. She had been the one to teach him that, in 100 small ways, without meaning to. She was not sure she regretted it. She was sure it was going to cost them both something before June. She felt it at breakfast. Not a sound, not a word. Dumbledore simply was not at the head table, and the space where he should have been had a quality to it, like a room where a window has just been shut. She noted it without showing that she had noted it. She poured her tea and ate 2 pieces of toast, and listened to the hall around her with the particular attention she reserved for things she could not yet name. By mid-morning she knew. A ministry summons, not a request, a summons, which was different in a way that mattered. Dumbledore had been absent for ministry obligations before. This felt different. She could have said that she had lived in this castle for 30-odd years and had learned to read it the way some people read weather. And the castle today had a held-breath quality she did not like. She taught her afternoon classes. She walked the corridors between them with more attention than usual. She did not see Harry at dinner. She found Ron and Hermione outside the 3rd-floor corridor at 7 o'clock. They were sitting on the floor. Ron's head was against the wall and his eyes were closed. Hermione was conscious but barely, one hand still pressed flat to the stone, as though she needed the ground to stay level. The door to the corridor stood open behind them. McGonagall crouched and checked them both in under 30 seconds. Alive, breathing steadily. Whatever had felled them had not been designed to kill. She looked at the open door, at the darkness beyond it, and then at Hermione's face, and understood the shape of the evening. She went in alone. The dog was already past. She did not ask how. Below the trapdoor the air was different, colder and closer, with a vegetable damp that turned to something mineral as she went deeper. She passed through the devil's snare by transfiguring a contained column of light. She crossed the keys room without a broomstick, and with considerably more efficiency than an 11-year-old would have managed. The chess pieces had already been cleared. Someone had won, or forced through, or both, the board in disarray, and one of the white pieces lying on its side with a crack through the stone. She moved past all of it methodically, without haste, which was not the same as without fear. The last chamber was still. Harry was standing over Quirrell's body. He turned when he heard her too quickly, off balance, and she saw it register in his face that he had not known whether it would be someone who meant him well. Then he saw her, and something in him came down a degree. Quirrell was dead. She looked at him for the necessary moment, the stilled chest, the hands, the face, and she accepted what she was seeing and moved on from it to what still required her attention. There was a mirror in the room, large and elaborately framed, that she had last seen on the 4th floor in January. She did not look into it. She looked at Harry's hands. The blisters were already rising across his palms and the insides of his fingers, where the skin had gone tight and pale in the way of a contact burn. He was holding them slightly away from his sides, as though he'd forgotten they were attached to him, which she recognized as the body's solution to pain it could not do anything about. She crossed the room. He let her look. The air around the mirror, smelled wrong, cold in the way that had nothing to do with temperature. The particular cold that she associated with things that should not exist in the same space as the living. She had felt it before in other contexts, in other years. She put it aside. "Can you walk?" she asked. Yes. She checked his pulse at his wrist without touching the blistered skin. Steady. His eyes were focused. Whatever had happened in this room had cost him, but he was present. "Then walk," she said. "We're leaving." He fell into step beside her without argument, which was notable. Harry was not a child who usually left rooms without looking back. He left this one with his eyes forward, and she did not ask him what that cost. She carried him for the last passage because the climb was steep and his hands were useless for gripping. He did not protest this either, which told her more about how he was doing than anything else had. She set him down when they reached the corridor. Ron and Hermione were exactly as she'd left them. She would get them up in a moment, would send for Madame Pomfrey, would manage all of it. But she paused there in the cold corridor and looked at Harry for 3 seconds. He was 11 years old. He had walked through 6 separate, magical obstacles, alone, and had come out the other side, and whatever had happened in the final chamber had happened beyond the reach of any preparation she had given him, and he was standing. She put her hand on the back of his head once, briefly, and then she took it away. "Hospital wing," she said. He went. She brought Ron and Hermione up herself. She sent her patroness to Pomfrey before she reached the stairs. She did everything in the correct order, because the correct order was what there was, and because stopping to feel the weight of the evening would not help anyone. She sat in the chair beside Harry's bed until Dumbledore came back. He arrived past midnight. She heard him in the corridor, the particular sound of his footsteps, unhurried, which had always struck her as the choice it was she stood. She gave him the chair without being asked, because he would want to speak to Harry, and because Harry would need him to be the person in the chair. And she was not sure what she was right now. His guardian, his teacher, something that didn't have a clean name, but she was certain it was not that. She stood by the door instead. Dumbledore sat. He looked at Harry for a long time without speaking. Harry was asleep, the blistered hands resting on top of the blanket where Pomfrey had positioned them. "He was alone," McGonagall said. Her voice was even. She had made it even. Quirrell was there, and then he wasn't, and Harry was alone in that room with whatever came through before it left. Dumbledore did not ask her how she knew something had passed through. He said quietly, "Yes." What was Quirrell carrying? The pause. The familiar pause, the one she had learned to read as calculation rather than uncertainty. Something he was not equipped to carry. She looked at the window. Outside, the grounds were very dark. The lake would be flat and lightless at this hour, the forest wall a shadow against a slightly less dark sky. She had looked at this window from 1,000 different emotional positions across 30 years, and it remained entirely indifferent to all of them. "He'll want to know what happened," she said. "When he wakes, I'll speak with him." "I know you will." She kept her eyes on the window. "I'm telling you that when you do, I would prefer you tell him the true version." Silence. "The version that includes what you knew," she said. "And when you knew it, and why a child arrived at that chamber tonight without knowing enough to have made a different choice." Dumbledore looked at her. She turned from the window and met it. "He made the choice he had," she said, "because it was the only one he had. He is going to want to know why." The silence stretched. Dumbledore's expression was not unkind, and was not yielding, and was something in between that she had looked at for 40 years and still could not entirely read. "I will tell him," Dumbledore said. what he can hold. She thought about arguing. She measured it against the sleeping boy, the blistered hands, the lateness of the hour. She picked up her robes. "I'll be in my office," she said. "If he asks for me—" She left. The corridor was cold and empty and utterly familiar, and she walked it toward her office with the particular steadiness of someone who would not allow themselves anything else yet. She had found him on a stone floor. She had carried him up. He was breathing and whole and asleep, behind a door at her back. That was enough for right now. It was going to have to be. He woke to the smell of dittany and the particular quality of light that meant early morning in the hospital wing, pale and directionless. The windows doing very little against the cloud cover outside. For a moment, he simply lay there, aware of his hands before he was aware of anything else. They had been wrapped while he slept. The bandaging was tight and warm, and he could feel the skin beneath it, in a way that had nothing to do with his fingertips. He turned his head. The chair beside his bed was empty. He had a vague memory of voices, McGonagall's, and then another one, lower, familiar, in the way of things overheard from distant rooms. But the memory had the quality of something assembled after the fact, rather than lived through. He wasn't sure which parts were real. He lay still and listened to the hospital wing be quiet. When Dumbledore came, Harry had been awake for perhaps 20 minutes watching the ceiling. He heard the door, heard the footsteps, and recognized them without looking, which was a strange thing to know about himself. Dumbledore settled into the chair. He did not speak immediately. Harry had spent enough of his life around people who were deciding how to say something to recognize the shape of that silence. "The stone is destroyed," Dumbledore said at last. "It was. We agreed, Nicholas and I, that it was the right thing. There will be no more of it." Harry considered this. He had not known, until last night, exactly what was under the trapdoor, and now he knew, and it was already gone. "And Quirrell is dead. You know that?" "I know." A pause. "What was he?" Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "He was a man who had made a terrible choice, and who had not fully understood when he made it that some choices cannot be undone." That wasn't quite an answer. Harry had gotten enough of those across 11 years to recognize the shape of those too. He looked at the bandaged hands resting on the blanket, and thought about Quirrell's face when they had touched. The expression of someone discovering, too late, the terms of their own arrangement. He was carrying something, Harry said. Someone, wasn't he? The pause. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "A fragment only." But yes. Harry had known this, in the chamber, in the way you know things that have just been demonstrated rather than explained. He did not ask its name. They were both aware whose name was being discussed, and he found he did not want to say it in a hospital bed before his hands had healed. Will he come back? Dumbledore did not look away. This was the thing Harry most noticed about him. In the moments that mattered, he did not break eye contact for the comfortable answer. "I believe he will try," he said. "What happened last night drove him back, but it did not end him. He is diminished. He is not gone." "That's what the professor told me," Harry said in December. "That no one knows." She was correct. A faint quality in Dumbledore's voice, something between acknowledgement and something older. She generally is. Harry absorbed this. The window light had shifted slightly, the clouds thinning somewhere above. His hands ached at a steady, low frequency he was beginning to think was simply going to be the condition of the next few days. "He couldn't touch me," he said Quirrell, "when I grabbed him." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, something more careful than that, as though he was deciding on precision rather than evasion. "Love is not a soft force," he said finally. It leaves marks. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing when she died for you, Harry. That choice, that specific act of love, lives in you. It is not Quirrell's fault that he did not understand what he was reaching for. He turned this over, the way he'd learned to turn things when he wasn't certain which part mattered most. He did not ask the next question out loud. He had learned also to know when a question was not going to get a complete answer, and to decide whether he wanted the incomplete answer or preferred to wait. He waited. Dumbledore seemed to recognize this. "You did," he said quietly. "Exactly what I hoped you would not have to do. I am sorry that the choice fell to you before it should have. You deserved more time." "It's all right," Harry said, which was not quite true. Dumbledore's expression suggested he knew that. "It isn't," Dumbledore said. "But it is survived, which is not nothing." He stayed a while longer. When he left, the chair held his warmth for a minute or two after. Ron came the next morning with Hermione behind him, and a nearly successful attempt at casualness that collapsed entirely when he saw the bandages. "Those are quite big bandages," he said. "I know," Harry said. "Do they hurt mostly when I move them?" Ron sat on the end of the bed. Hermione took the chair and clasped her hands in her lap in the way she had when she was suppressing the impulse to say several things at once. Harry waited. "We're sorry," she said. "The devil's snare. Ron pulled me out, but then something else, we don't know what exactly. It doesn't matter." "It does matter." She looked at him directly. "You went the rest of the way alone. That's not Hermione." He kept his voice easy. "You both came as far as you could. You did the chessboard." He looked at Ron. "You won." Ron went red, in a complicated way. "Well, yes." "That's not nothing," Harry said, and realized as he said it that he'd borrowed the phrase from half a day ago and decided that was fine. They stayed for an hour. Ron talked about the chess pieces in significant detail. Hermione let him, which Harry recognized as its own kind of generosity. By the time Madame Pomfrey ushered them out, he found he was tired again, which seemed disproportionate to the effort of having a conversation, and he let himself sleep. The term ended. The other students left on the express with the accumulated noise of trunks and owls and shouted goodbyes, and the castle shifted into its summer register, the particular quality of silence that came after. Harry had always liked it. He walked the empty corridors with the unhurried gait of someone who had nowhere specific to be, which was true, and who had no reason to hurry, which was also true. He helped Hagrid in the grounds. He borrowed books from the library without a due date. The bandages came off after a fortnight and left skin that was new and slightly over-pink, and worked, which was the part that mattered. McGonagall found him on the astronomy tower one evening, late enough that the grounds below had gone dark and shapeless, the lake a flat nothing in the middle distance. She stood beside him without asking what he was doing there. She was good at that, at arriving in a place and not requiring an explanation of it. "I'm not frightened," Harry said, after a while. "I didn't ask," she said. He looked out at the dark grounds. The forest was a wall on the right. Somewhere in the middle of the lake, a surface ripple caught nothing and disappeared. "I think he'll come back," he said. "Voldemort. I think it'll happen again, one way or another." "I think so too," she said. The directness of it was, as always, the thing he found most steadying about her. She did not soften it, and she did not expand it. She simply agreed, and the agreement made it something that could be stood in, rather than something that had to be faced alone. They stayed there until the last of the light had left the sky entirely and the grounds had become only sound night birds, the water, the faint rhythm of the forest edge. She did not put her hand on his shoulder, or tell him it would be all right, and he did not need her to. When she turned to go, he followed. They walked back down the tower stairs together without speaking, which was enough. It was, he thought, what having someone was. Second year felt different in the way that cuts feel different once they've scarred over, not healed exactly, but changed in texture. The corridor story had mutated across the summer and returned to Hogwarts in September in a form Harry barely recognized. He had apparently dueled Voldemort, had apparently done it barehanded, had apparently died briefly and been revived by something ancient and powerful that lived in his scar. None of this was true in its particulars. All of it was true in the way myths are true, which he was beginning to understand was its own category. Older students watched him in the corridors with a kind of sideways attention, not quite awe, not quite fear, which he found more exhausting than either would have been on its own. He played Quidditch. He sat through classes. He ate meals with Ron and Hermione, who had spent the summer apart, but arrived back on the train already, talking as though they'd merely been in different rooms. He was glad of it. Then, in October, the walls started speaking. He heard it first coming back from the library. A voice that wasn't quite a voice, a sound that moved through the stone like something dragged rather than carried. Cold, purposeful. It had direction. He stopped in the middle of the corridor and Hermione walked into him. "Harry, listen," he said. She listened. "I don't hear anything." He looked at her. Then at Ron, who had also stopped and was looking at the ceiling in the manner of someone trying to be helpful. He heard it for another 4 seconds, and then it was gone, and the corridor was just a corridor, smelling of cold stone and someone's discarded lunch. And he stood in it feeling the particular loneliness of having perceived something alone. He went to McGonagall that evening. She was in her office correcting 4th-year essays, the lamp pulling a small circle of yellow light out of the room's dark. She did not tell him to sit. He sat. Anyway, the way he had since he was small enough that the chair had seemed enormous. She set her quill down. He described what he had heard. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not dismissive, not alarmed, the specific quality of quiet that meant she was thinking rather than deciding how to respond. "You're certain it had direction," she said. "North and down," he said. "I think—" She looked at him for another moment. "I'll speak to Dumbledore." "Do you believe me?" "Yes," she said, without theatre, which was the right answer. "I believe you heard something. What it was, I don't yet know." She picked up her quill and then put it down again. "Stay out of the passages at night, Harry. I wasn't in the passages at night. I know I'm saying it anyway." He went back to Gryffindor Tower and lay in his bed and listened to the castle being quiet and did not hear anything else. But the memory of it stayed with him, that cold, purposeful sound moving through stone as though the stone were merely inconvenient. The first message appeared on the corridor wall near the library before Halloween. "Mrs. Norris was found suspended below the words, stiffened and staring alive, but clearly not well." Harry stood at the edge of the crowd that gathered and read the message twice. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the Here, beware." The words had been written in what looked like paint, but probably wasn't, and the look of them, the size, the deliberateness, suggested something that had wanted to be read. McGonagall arrived before Dumbledore did. Harry watched her face as she read it. She did not let the staff see her hands. He noticed this because he was standing close enough to notice it, and because he had been watching her face in moments of crisis for long enough to know what the controlled version looked like and what was underneath it. Filch was white and shaking. Dumbledore arrived and spoke to him quietly. The crowd was dispersed. The following morning, the staff room had the particular atmosphere of a room in which difficult things had already been said before Harry passed its open door. McGonagall was standing at the window. Her hands were at her sides. Colin Creevey, next. Then Justin Finch Fletchley. Then Nearly Headless Nick, which Harry would not have thought possible, and which everyone else also would not have thought possible, and which had happened anyway. The castle became a different place in small increments. Parents sent letters, students moved in groups. The teachers held emergency meetings that he was not in but heard about, corridors echoing with the particular sound of institutional concern, trying to sound like institutional calm. He heard his own name in those corridors more than he would have liked. The story about second year had a new chapter now, and it involved the voice in the walls that only Harry Potter could hear, which no one said was suspicious, except in the way they didn't say it. He went back to McGonagall. She had been acting on something since his first visit. He could tell from the slight economy of her movements, the way she'd begun watching the castle's surfaces rather than only its students. She stood by the window when he came in, which was unusual. She usually sat. "There's more," he said. "There is," she agreed. "Do you know what the chamber is?" She turned from the window. In her face was the particular expression of someone who knows a thing and is deciding how much of it is safe to give. "It's a legend, mostly," she said. "Salazar Slytherin built it, so the story goes, before he left the school. A creature inside it. Something capable of petrification." She looked at him steadily. "A basilisk is one possibility." Harry thought about the cold voice in the walls, the direction of it. "A basilisk is blind in the dark," he said, "but it can hear." She looked at him. Something in her expression adjusted. "Who told you that?" "Library," he said. "After the first time I heard the voice, she was quiet." This was, he could see it, one of those moments where she was recalibrating the way she sometimes did when he did something that surprised her, not because it was unexpected, but because it arrived earlier than her model had accounted for. He had been surprising her this way since he was small enough that the chair had seemed enormous. He didn't mind it. "I've passed everything you've told me to Dumbledore," she said. "He is aware of the pattern. He is," a pause, very brief, "working on it." Harry looked at her. He was 12, and he knew her well enough to hear the thing she hadn't said, which was that Dumbledore was not working on it quickly enough. She would not say this. She would not undermine the headmaster to him, had never done it, had maintained the institution's face in front of him, even when the institution had not fully deserved it. But the pause was there. "What should I do?" he said. It was not quite a question. "You should attend your classes," she said. "You should tell me immediately if you hear the voice again. You should not pursue this alone." She looked at him directly. "I mean that last part, Harry. I know you do. I need to know that you know. I mean it." He held her gaze. "I know you mean it," he said, and it was both true and incomplete, and from the look on her face, she understood both parts of that. She held the look for a moment longer. Then she gave a very small nod and picked up her quill. He left. The corridor outside was cold, and the castle was settling into its evening sounds, the pipes, the stones, the ghost footsteps of students several floors above. He thought about the pattern of the attacks, the petrifications, the deliberateness of the message on the wall, which had wanted an audience. Something was moving through the castle. It had a purpose. It was waiting for something, or building toward something, or both. He walked back to the tower and did not pursue it alone, which was not the same as not thinking about it. The suspension notice came on a Tuesday. McGonagall was in her office when Dumbledore told her. Not in the formal way, not with the ministry's letter already in hand, but in the way he told her things. He wanted her to hear from him first. He came to her door in the early afternoon, and she knew before he finished the sentence. "They're calling it a precaution," he said. "It isn't a precaution," she said. "It's a message." He did not argue with her. He left the school before supper, and she stood at the window of the Transfiguration classroom and watched the gates until the light changed and there was nothing left to watch. She moved. Nothing in his office. This was a decision she made once and did not revisit. The chair empty behind the desk, the portraits watching her from the walls with an attention she did not acknowledge, the various instruments ticking and gleaming in their places as though waiting for hands they recognized. She took the meetings. She signed the papers. She answered the owls in language that was precise and gave nothing unnecessary away. She was acting headmistress in the way a person stands in a doorway, present but not claiming the room. The message appeared on the wall 2 days later. She read it, surrounded by students and teachers and the accumulated sound of a corridor, discovering something terrible. And the words were large and deliberate, and written in something she could not let herself look at too long. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. She read it twice. She did not read it a third time. Ginny Weasley. First year, red hair. She had spoken to the girl in September about homesickness and the particular adjustment of being the youngest of many siblings who had all come before. She had sat across a desk from her and thought, ordinary first-year difficulty, this will pass. For the first time since she had scooped a 15-month-old from a Privet Drive doorstep and apparated into a side street, Minerva McGonagall felt entirely alone. She organized the teachers. She assigned the searches. She made the decisions that needed making in the flat, efficient way that decisions needed to be made when there was no one above her in the chain to refer them upward to. She did not let them see her hands. Harry came to her office that evening. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair that had always seemed enormous when he was small enough that his feet hadn't reached the floor, and he looked at her the way he looked at her when he had already made a calculation and wanted her to know he had made it, not to share it, but to establish that it existed. "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her Polyjuice potion, and she filed away the separate concern that was for another moment. Suspicions that had been building since September. The voice in the walls, the timing of the attacks, moaning Myrtle's bathroom as a point of connection. His voice was even, the way his voice was when he was managing something internally that he did not intend to put down. She did not ask how he had come by any of it. The Polyjuice would keep. Pow airs. What he had given her was a direction, and directions were what she needed. "The bathroom," she said. "Myrtle said someone came in and threw a book at her," he said, "before she died a long time ago. She thought it came from one of the sinks." McGonagall was quiet. She looked at him across the desk in the lamplight and felt, not for the first time but more acutely than usual, the specific weight of being the person between him and the thing he was pointing himself at. "Be careful," she said. She meant it differently than she had ever meant anything. He seemed to understand this. He nodded once, in the manner of someone who has received what was offered and is going to carry it, but is not going to promise anything she couldn't hold him to. He left. She did not sleep well. She was not there when he went in. This was the thing she would return to in the days afterward, not with guilt exactly, but with the particular quality of reckoning that came from having known something was coming and not having found the mechanism to stop it. She had watched him for 11 years. She knew the difference between telling her the truth and telling her all of it. She had extracted the acknowledgement from him in October, and she had trusted it more than she should have. He came back in the early afternoon through the entrance to the girls' bathroom on the second floor, and she was there because she had gone looking for him 2 hours after he failed to appear at lunch. And she had been standing in the corridor for 20 minutes reasoning through the building, with the cold focus of someone who does not allow themselves panic as a working mode. Ron Weasley first, white-faced and mud-streaked and blinking in the corridor light, like someone newly arrived from a country with different weather. Then Ginny, who was shaking in the way that came after rather than during, her school robes dirty and her eyes red and present. Then Harry. He was carrying a sword. She knew it. She had not seen it outside a portrait in 40 years, but she knew it. The rubies in the handle, the name on the blade, the particular way it sat in his hands, as though he had not entirely decided what to do with it. His face was pale, and there was a tear in the sleeve of his robe that had something dark at its edge. She chose not to look at directly. Yet she stood in the corridor and looked at all three of them for a long moment. The silence was not awkward. It was the kind that followed enormity, the kind that needed a moment to settle before it could hold the weight of what came after. "Ginny," she said, "are you hurt?" Ginny shook her head. A small motion, very careful, as though she was testing whether it would hold. "You're going to Madame Pomfrey," McGonagall said. "Now, not in a moment now." She turned to Ron. "You're going with her. I'm all right." "I didn't say you weren't." She looked at him steadily. "Your mother is going to hear about this, Ronald. All of it." Ron's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession and landed somewhere between resigned and afraid, which she considered an appropriate response. He put his arm around Ginny's shoulders, and they moved off down the corridor, Ginny's feet finding a steadier rhythm after the first few steps. McGonagall turned to Harry. He was still holding the sword. He looked, she thought, like someone who had just arrived somewhere they had been traveling toward without knowing it, and was still taking the measure of the ground. She looked at him for another long moment, at his face, which was giving her the information she needed in the way it always gave her information, not freely, but available, if she looked for it. He was 12 years old. He had gone into the Chamber of Secrets with a sword that was not his, and come back out with it. She could feel, somewhere in her chest, the structural complaint of a person trying to contain something too large for containment. She did not act on it. She would not act on it here. "Come with me," she said. He fell into step beside her. They walked in silence down the corridor, which settled around them the way castle corridors settled when they were not being asked to be anything, just stone and light and the distant sound of the school existing elsewhere. "Madame Pomfrey first," she said. "That sleeve. It's not bad. That is not a determination you are qualified to make." She glanced at him. "Then, you will tell me everything from the beginning." He looked ahead. "Yes," he said. Not all of it, she knew. Some of it. She would have to work for the rest. The way she had always worked for it. Patiently, and without pressure, because pressure only told her what he thought she wanted to hear, and she had never wanted that. She had wanted the real thing. She had always wanted the real thing. She supposed on balance, so had he. The aftermath arrived in pieces. Humphrey took one look at Harry's sleeve and pulled him behind a curtain, with the decisive efficiency of someone who had learned not to ask questions until the bleeding stopped. McGonagall sat in the chair beside the bed and waited. The ward was quiet, Ginny in a curtained bay at the far end, Ron having been sent to find his mother by Flu, the other petrified students still in their conjured sleep. And the quiet had a particular quality, the kind that followed something enormous. Harry emerged from behind the curtain with a clean forearm and a look on his face that said he considered the business settled. She looked at his arm. Then at his face. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not all at once. He never did things all at once. But in the careful, layered way he had always given her information, starting with the mechanism and working backward toward the feeling, only when he ran out of mechanism to put in front of it. The entrance in Myrtle's bathroom. The sink. The passage down. He described it in his even voice, the one that meant he was managing something internally, and she sat very still and let him manage it. When he reached the chamber itself, he stopped for a moment, not dramatically. Just a pause, the kind that meant the next part required some arrangement before it could be spoken. There was a diary, he said. Ginny had been writing in it all year. It wrote back. McGonagall was quiet. Tom Riddle, he said. That was the name in it. He had been using her, feeding on her. He said the more she put into the diary, the more real he became. He looked at his clean forearm. He had almost finished. She did not say anything immediately. She was thinking about a first-year girl who had come to her office in September and told her she missed home, and about the year that had preceded this moment, and about all the distance between those two things. "The sword," she said finally. "The hat," he said, and then looked at her, because he seemed to understand that required elaboration. "I asked for help. The sorting hat was there, I don't know how, it was just there, and I put it on, and the sword came out of it. The sorting hat and the sword of Gryffindor were not hers to explain. That was Dumbledore's territory, and she knew it, but she filed it. She filed all of it. The basilisk," she said. "I killed it," he said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact that still had some strangeness left in it. She looked at him. 12 years old. He had gone into the Chamber of Secrets and killed a basilisk with the sword of Gryffindor, and he was reporting this to her in the hospital wing, with his hands folded in his lap. "How?" she said. "Through the mouth," he said. "It can't use its stare in the dark, and I couldn't look at it directly, so I went for the mouth." He paused. "One of the fangs went through my arm before it died, Harry. Pomfrey says it's fine. She gave me something." He held up the arm briefly, as if this settled it. "There was a phoenix forks. He cried on it." She was quiet for a moment. There was a great deal to hold. She was holding it. "Ginny," she said. "She woke up when the diary was destroyed." He looked at the curtained bay at the end of the ward. She didn't know most of what had happened. She remembered writing in the diary and then... not much. McGonagall thought about the message on the wall. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. She had read it twice and not a third time, and she understood now the precise narrowness of what had not happened. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was level. "When you knew enough to go, you knew enough to come to me first." He looked at her. He did not argue, which meant he knew she was right and was also not going to pretend the conclusion would have been different. She understood this. She did not agree with it. She did not say so again. "I know," he said. It was the real answer. Not, "I'm sorry," which would have been the answer designed to end the conversation. "I know," which meant he had heard her and was keeping it. She let it be. Dumbledore returned 2 days later. He came to her office first, the chair behind the desk empty since his departure, the instruments still ticking in their places, the portraits watching with careful attention she had not acknowledged for the better part of a week. He came through the door, and she rose, and something in the transition of the room shifted around them without ceremony. "The office is yours," she said. "Thank you, Minerva." He looked at her with the attention he gave things he was also calculating, the look that meant two things at once, and she had long since made her peace with being unable to fully separate them. "You held it well." "The school held itself," she said. "I kept the paperwork moving." He sat, she sat. Between them, without needing to be named, was the week. Harry came the following afternoon. McGonagall was present. Dumbledore had asked her, in the way he asked her, things that were also directives, and she sat to the side and watched. She had watched Dumbledore's face in consequential conversations for long enough to know the difference between the face he showed to people and the face he used when he was thinking past the immediate exchange. She watched for that difference. Harry told him about the diary, Tom Riddle the possession, Ginny writing in it all year. He was precise and economical in the way McGonagall had taught him, perhaps without meaning to, by modeling precision and economy for 11 years. Dumbledore listened. His face was the face he showed to people, attentive, grave, warm, and behind it, she was quite certain, something was moving, something large. She could not see its shape, and she was not going to be shown it today. And she accepted this because she had long practice accepting the things Dumbledore chose not to show her, and because she trusted that he stored things carefully, even when she disagreed with the storing. "Someone gave Ginny the diary," Harry said. He was not asking. "Someone who knew what it was," Dumbledore said. "It appears so." "They gave a weapon to a first-year girl," Harry said, "in a school." "Yes," Dumbledore said. The mildness of it was not nothing. McGonagall knew his mildness well enough to know when it was real, and when it was the form outrage took in a man who had long since learned that outrage was most powerful when contained. She watched his face and understood he was holding something she was not yet allowed to know. She stored the understanding. She would take it out later, in private, and try to find its edges. Harry looked at Dumbledore for a moment. 12 years old, sitting across from the headmaster in a chair too large for him, arriving at the same assessment McGonagall had arrived at, and deciding, as she had decided, to let it rest. He was better at that than she would have been at his age. She was not sure if that was a good thing. The term ended quietly, in the way things ended after too much had happened, not with resolution, but with exhaustion, the particular emptiness of a building that has been holding its breath, and finally let it out. The great hall became an echo. The corridors found their summer stillness. Harry stayed. He was at the staff table on the second evening across from her, eating toast, and the great hall was empty around them. And outside the windows the grounds were long and golden.